Welcome. This is Steve Shadrack, founder of Support Raising Solutions. This podcast is part of a 15-week series launching your first 100 days after boot camp. Today's episode is hosted by our friend, Aaron Babiar.
Hey, I'm joined today by a good friend of mine, actually. His name is Micah May. Micah and I have been leading a lot of public boot camps together nationally for close to 4 years. I'd say he's led probably 75% of them with me. And in that amount of time, we've actually really become pretty good buddies. So we've kind of been able to travel the nation together quite a bit. So that's not the whole point of our friendship, of course. That's just kind of something that's happened along the way because, like me, I know Mike is very passionate about helping leaders be spiritually healthy, vision-driven, and fully funded. So, Micah, thanks for being with me today.
Thanks, Aaron. It's a privilege and an honor.
Yeah. Hey, I know that you've been with FCA for, is it 10 years now?
Yes.
Okay, cool. And some people have heard your story, but just remind us real quickly, for those that haven't, just a little bit about, you're one of those people that you raised some support, you failed an awful lot, and then at one point you actually went through a boot camp, and that just changed stuff for you, right?
So I came on staff in 2007 and was given 30 school districts, 2 universities, a lot of responsibility, and said, go raise your support with no training. And so I didn't do it. I was terrible at it, and I just didn't have the confidence. And about 2.5 years into it, I was asking God, you gotta provide.
Yeah, you
got to show me. And his answer, his provision, was actually sending me to a training. There was a new staff guy that had been through a Support Raising Solutions boot camp, and in 4 months had raised full support. And I called him. I said, hey, you got to tell me what you did. And he said, man, you just got to go to boot camp. So I did that. I didn't know Support Raising Solutions. I didn't know Steve Shadrack, but I signed up and went to boot camp, and it was a game changer. There, I felt called again, that this was the ministry that God had called me in, that he did have a plan, and there were actually partners out there just waiting on me to go ask them to join our team. And I left boot camp in 2010 and went and got fully funded, and it exploded our ministry. We hired staff and more ministry than we've ever done before because of it. And so from that, I started sharing with other friends, hey, you got to go to boot camp. And so it created I guess you could say, like a national mini revival within FCA.
I think you became a funnel for FCA is what you did. Yeah, everybody started going through Micah and going to boot camps. And at one point, Steve Shadrack said, hey, we got to talk some more. Is that pretty much how it went?
Yeah. He approached me about doing some training, and now it's a requirement for anybody who's even thinking about coming on staff with FCA. The very first thing they have to do is do something called tryout training and Support Raising Solutions boot camp.
Now, Fellowship of Christian Athletes has a lot of staff. About how many nationally are there?
About 1,700.
Okay, great. And I know you've played a part in training a lot of them, because once you got fully funded, I mean, we're fast forwarding a few years, but at one point, they asked you to become their kind of in-house trainer. So you train all the new Fellowship of Christian Athletes staff. So off the top of your head, would you say about how many people have you helped train in raising support?
Through FCA, about 1,000, and then through public SRS boot camps, about 2,000.
Yeah. Well, God is good. He's blessed you. He's blessed your family, and I know that you're like one of the guys that jumped out there and raised some support really poorly before you ever got any training. And at that point, you had a wife and a couple of kids, and then it got a lot more serious for you. So I've always admired your dedication, and not only how you've led your family well, and I know you well enough to know that you are leading your family well, but also how you're helping lead other leaders. And listening to this today are probably people that they've gone through, if not the boot camp, they've gone through foundations, or maybe they just got a book like the God Ask or something like that, and they found a podcast out there. But in many cases, these are people that they've probably only been raising support for maybe 2.5 months. And so they've experienced, just a whole host of different things and rejection and great wins and all that kind of stuff. But I want to circle back to that whole spiritually healthy, vision-driven, fully funded kind of mantra, if anything, that we have, and I know you have as well, and just ask you to unpack that a little bit. Think way back to 10 plus years ago when you were raising your support. What were you doing wrong in your first couple of months, even after you had some training maybe? What were you kind of doing wrong that you look back and you go, man, I didn't quite get vision driven. I didn't quite get spiritually healthy.
Well, prior to boot camp, I was doing everything wrong because I was clueless and I was scared to death to do anything because I knew that I didn't know, and so I was kind of paralyzed because I was afraid to do anything because I felt like I was doing it wrong. And so when I went to boot camp, it gave me the confidence I needed to move forward. And so, being spiritually healthy, I think that's the foundational principle in our Christian walk with Christ. And I think of a story of David and Goliath and how unlikely it was for David to go out and just defeat Goliath that day. He was not even in the military. He was the least likely person. And yet he had the faith, and he was spiritually healthy enough, connected to the vision of God, that when there was the opponent God had prepared him to defeat, that he ran and defeated Goliath. And so I look at, support raising a lot like that we have to stay connected, because without that, there's no way in David's right mind he would go out and face Goliath.
Seriously, right?
I mean, there's no way.
That wasn't smart.
Right. So, and likewise, to do great things in the kingdom of God, we can't rely on our own strength or our own abilities, because there's no way we would do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so for us to be, for us to get that next level of being vision driven, we have to first, it's the foundational principle. We got to be spiritually healthy, which is staying connected in the Word, relationship with the church, and our relationship with Christ. So,
yeah. All right. So I'm going to ask you to dig in on that a little bit. And this can be from your own life, maybe from some of the people you've coached, and you don't want to share their names. That's fine. But so what's it kind of look like? And I know it's not pretty, but what's it look like when somebody, they've gotten some training, they're a couple of months out of boot camp, and they're not spiritually healthy?
Well, it's kind of like trying to drive a vehicle that's running on fumes. That kind of picture where it's going, it's starting, it's going, it's starting, it's barely getting by. Or you can think of trying to drink from, let's say, a glass of water with a hole in the bottom of it. It's just there's no substance to sustain you in moving forward. So everything that you do is you're barely getting by, if that.
And by everything, you mean everything. You're talking about marriages,
marriage, relationships, everything. If you're not spiritually, it affects every part of our life. And so, I mean, I think as far as priority number one is stay connected.
Yeah. I'm staying on the spiritually healthy theme for a minute here. When people go into support raising appointments and they're not really connected to the vine, they're not really walking with Jesus, they bring some expectations, maybe even some demands. I hate to say the word coercion that can be a part of a thing. It's not really a spirit-filled invitation. It's more of a presentation. Tell us more.
I mean, I've seen so many times when I've sat down with somebody. I'll think of a guy named Carl who gives me support from time to time, and I asked him if he would sit down with me and just have coffee, and he kind of knew I was wanting to raise some monthly support.
Sure.
He just said, "Hey, Mike, I'm not really interested in giving monthly. I'll just give as God lays it on my heart." And I said, "That's fine." He said, "But do you still want to grab coffee?" Well, inside of me, I guess the natural side might have said no. He's already said no.
Move on. Right. Yeah.
But in the spirit side, I felt like something just said yes. So I said, "Sure, let's grab coffee." Well, as we begin to share in that support,
I'm going to interrupt you really quickly then. So I want to just kind of clarify what you just said. It made sense to say no, but because you were walking with the Lord, you were, we'll say, prayed up, for lack of a better term. You sense the Holy Spirit saying, still get together with him. Even though he's not going to give you any money, at least that's what he's saying, get together with him, build your relationship, right? Yeah,
and as we began to sit down about halfway through the meeting, it was like God showed up. I don't know the best way to say it, but he began to share his story, how he came to faith later in life, and I began to share my story, and he began to cry, and I began to cry, and we had this beautiful, beautiful God moment in this middle of a restaurant, drinking coffee.
And it wasn't forced. There was no expectations.
No, I mean, I wasn't even going to ask, because he had just told me 30 minutes earlier, I'm not going to join your monthly support team.
Okay.
And by the end of the meeting, he looked at me, he said, "Hey, go ahead and sign me up for monthly support." And so awesome. It's just, that's one of those things that's a God thing. In the natural, he said no. In the natural, I would have said no. But I said, "You know what, God, if it's you, it's cool." And so that was a cool eye-opening experience how God can open up doors even that seem closed.
Yeah. So spiritual health, it can kind of it can make meetings go really bad, but the flip side is spiritual health can make meetings go really good because when you're connected to the Lord and the results, so to speak, or what happens in those meetings, if you're just laying that at the feet of the Lord and just listen to what He says, things can happen that are really, really beyond your control in a good way. And sometimes you're going to get a no when you're spiritually healthy. Talk about the response. What does that feel like when you're walking with the Lord? You have an opportunity to invite somebody, you do it, and you might even be thinking, I think they might say yes, or this is somebody of significant means. I think they could probably say yes here, and you give the invitation, and they say, yeah, Mike, I don't think I'm going to join your team, and yet it doesn't throttle you. Tell us a little about that.
Well, a thought comes to mind that says, God only trusts those who He's tested, and I think sometimes a no is a test if it will remain faithful to Him and faithful to the process. Because I don't care how long you've been support raising training. In my experience, a no is still a no, and being spiritually healthy has allowed me to draw into Him versus try to get caught up in what the enemy would like for me to be caught up in, which is thinking about why did they say no? What could I have done differently? And those thought process versus just saying, God, I trust you. And this person is not who you wanted to have on my team at this time. Yeah. Maybe at a later date, let me remain faithful to the process of calls, appointments, and faithful to the belief that you're going to provide for me regardless of this appointment.
Yeah. Great. Hey, let's segue a little bit into the vision driven. I know that those have gone through the SRS training, we tend to embellish and have a little fun with this. We're talking about budget driven versus vision driven, but early on in your days of raising support, maybe it was pre-training or maybe it was soon after training, and you were balancing all of that. What was, or just give us an example, but what was something a need, maybe it was a purchase of the ministry need or something where you had to kind of reevaluate why and how am I making this purchase, or why and how am I asking for these funds so that it will fund the mission? Because I know you guys do a lot with camps and with kids, and share a little bit about budget driven versus vision driven, how that impacts lives.
Absolutely. Well, when you're budget driven, which disclaimer, we're all for having a budget, but when your lack of funding is making all the decisions, I don't feel like that's pleasing to God, and I don't think it's vision driven. And so when you're budget driven, for lack of a better term, is a lot of times you may have a need, but you really wonder, if I can do this, can I send these kids that can't afford to go to camp? How will it affect the budget? Whereas when you're vision driven, you raise enough to send kids to camp. And I know last year we sent over 204 kids to camp, and out of those 204, 172 received camp scholarships. That's just from my FCA area. And so I've seen firsthand what before boot camp, when I was budget driven, we may have sent 50.
Wow.
And being vision driven is saying, let's not turn any kid away that wants to go to camp, trusting God that we'll work ahead of time, but also that He was going to meet the need. And it's amazing. I keep offering more camp scholarships probably than we've even raised, because every time God has always come through with the exact amount of money that
Praise
we needed
Lord.
To cover those kids in camp.
And so, those kids are going to hear the gospel. You know they're going to get some opportunity to respond to something that's probably not in their normal everyday right now.
Well, we've all been to camps and how life-changing they are, and FCA camp is no exception. It is a powerful, life-changing camp.
Yeah.
And it's pretty exciting to be a part of that, and people love giving to send kids to camp.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. What about on the personal side? So you're talking organizationally, but what's that look like for you and your family to not be budget driven, but to be vision driven? Because I know for sure there's people listening to this that are thinking, oh, well, we're missionaries, so little Timmy can't play Little League this year. I mean, different context, whatever else, but they're wanting to almost over and above make sacrifices that and I'm not saying God doesn't ask us to sacrifice, but they're trying to do sacrifices that the Lord might not even be asking of them to save a buck. What's the May family, the Micah May family? What are some things you guys have learned about that?
Well, that's exactly how I felt walking into boot camp, because I'd been on staff for almost 3 years, and the struggle was that I wasn't making enough to take care of my family, but I felt called to the ministry.
That's conviction,
I wanted to do the ministry, but I didn't know how I was going to do that and provide for my family. And that's why I feel like I even train boot camps to now, is because my life literally was changed at that boot camp when God gave me a vision for our ministry. And it wasn't what I had been living. I had been living on half of a paycheck of what I should have been receiving.
Yeah.
And when I met Steve Shadrack and I saw him, he had peace. He was making a massive impact.
Yeah.
And even though we were having impact, I know that because we saw that, it wasn't near on the scale that it is today. So being vision driven for me is saying we don't have to live like that anymore, and we can have massive impact on the kingdom.
Yeah.
And on another note is like, I want my kids to love being a missionary's kid or being an FCA staff. And so they don't think as FCA. If I would have stayed where I was, we would be in definitely trouble at this point in time.
Yeah.
I physically couldn't, but...
And disclaimer here, I know your wife, I know your kids, I've seen your car, I've seen your house. You are not somebody that lives this luxurious lifestyle, but by no means are you living a poverty mindset either. Your family is, we'll just say they're well adjusted and they're loving Jesus, and that's a beautiful thing to see.
Yeah, and that's what I want my kids to love the Lord and see His faith lived out. And I feel like that when they think of me and my position with FCA, I don't think they regret. I had one person come through boot camp, and their whole goal growing up was to not be a missionary. And the reason why that is because their family lived so poorly that was their goal. As a child, they were malnourished. And so, if God calls you to do something specifically unique to you, that's great. But within FCA, we have very safe salary ranges that's set by the National FCA Board. And so I'm within that range, and it feels good to take care of my family. It really does.
Boy, it does. It does. All right. So the fully funded, we know that's that whole concept right there. That's what brings people to probably find this podcast. Being fully funded is what brings people to sign up for foundations or go through a boot camp training or something like that. But definition wise, what's a good definition for fully funded?
A great definition that I heard from Steve Shadrack is being fully funded is maximizing the fruitfulness of your family and ministry. Raising enough funds to maximize the fruitfulness of your family and ministry.
Not or.
No, it's both.
Yeah. And
that's kind of when I was sitting in that boot camp and I heard that statement, and I realized that I was the opposite of that. I don't even know how you say it, minimizing the fruitfulness of my family and my ministry. I was doing the bare minimum in family, bare minimum in ministry. What a game changer when we went to boot camp, got fully funded, and I started seeing the max. And there's no ceiling, there's no max, but I was maximizing the different aspects of my family's life and of ministry.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Micah, you're a Jonathan type friend to me, particularly in this world that God has allowed our paths to cross repeatedly in loving on leaders and equipping them to survive and thrive and helping them be spiritually healthy and vision driven and fully funded. So it's definitely an honor and a joy to sit down with you, and thank you for sharing your heart and from some of your personal experience. And God bless you as you continue to lead forward in a lot of different ways. I know most of that is with FCA, but I appreciate the time that we get to serve together as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron.
Thanks for joining us. We encourage you to listen and subscribe to the SRS podcast that answers questions and dives into topics relevant to ministry partner development. For more resources, browse our website, supportraisingsolutions.org.